It was such a Klondike. Mackerel had never been fished before. The government had banned herring fishing. It didn't finish the way it started. It started with a terrific boom. The end of it was much, much more gradual. At its peak, I think there was something like about 3 times the population of Ullapool living on the loch. I remember watching some of the fishing boats come down Loch Broom, and I've seen a boat with the sea across its deck completely weighed down with mackerel, and they couldn't bring them in fast enough. But in the winter, which is when most of the fishing was being done anyway, it was like a horizontal Manhattan out there. It's just lights of ships right out to Annet Bay and beyond, and right down the loch. We had a ship that came in with an Egyptian crew. They were sitting cross-legged on the street selling jewellery, and they kind of got moved on. And the Russians were always walking around with black bin bags, and they would have hats. In Ullapool, mostly all the men were wearing Russian hats and smoking Russian cigarettes and drinking vodka. We had caviar in the cafe counter for a while as well. So there was lots of bargaining going on. Ullapool Entertainments had the Edinburgh String Quartet, and they offered Russian composers. We thought it would be a brilliant idea to invite the Russians to come to our concert. So for whatever reason they didn't come, but we told the quartet that we had asked them, and they were intrigued by that. So they went out in a boat and played, the 4 musicians playing and the Russians hanging over the boat.
I mean, as I understand, the Klondike was gold. He found gold, he found a Klondike. Once the mackerel started and the pursers were beginning to catch such vast amounts of it, the only people that could handle it were the Russians. And from the Russian point of view in these days, it was a very cheap source of protein. Then came the Poles, the East Germans. We've had Klondykers here from Egypt, Nigeria. Klondykers were there simply as floating factories. They had 2 crews. They had a ship's crew, and then they had the processing crew. I mean, there'd be 300 or 400 people on each of them. I think there'd probably equal numbers of men and women on board. The only way they could get ashore was on the ship's lifeboats. And you used to see the lifeboats going out, and they were nearly top heavy with a number of people and televisions. They couldn't buy televisions, and they would go away with the strangest things. They would buy boxes of disposable nappies. They thought these were wonderful. Getting towards the end of the season, whoever the ship's agent would hire a bus, and they would all pile in, and they would go to Inverness, and they would spend a day shopping in Inverness, and they would come back again. But the commissar always went with them. Well, it's bad in Ullapool. At one point, the media discovered that there was 4,000 Russians coming ashore, not all at once, but in Ullapool. And for a couple of days, you couldn't walk down the street with somebody saying, "I'm from the Daily Telegraph. You must be having trouble with these Russians." And I said, "No, they're no bother at all." But they never were any trouble.
But it could be very difficult in the pharmacy. We would get a lot coming in wanting medication for their family at home. That was very, very difficult, because they would often be asking for stuff, and I had a big, thick book that I could look up names and see where they were, what the ingredients were. So something that they would be asking for. And many of the things that they were asking for were not available in the West, basically because they were useless, but they were still using them at home. The crews would come in 3s, and one would be watching the other 2, because basically they didn't trust each other. And you could always tell the political ones, because they were the ones with the clean hands and short and manicured nails. And then they would sometimes come in and ask for medication which was available over here, but I couldn't give it to them. I couldn't sell it to them. There was no way I could legally let them have it, because they were prescription-only medicines. I remember men standing there and crying and saying, "But my father, he's dying. He needs these medicines." And I just found it really, really hard.
We bought some tin openers with lovely painted wooden handles. I think we've still got one. Beautifully painted, was it from Ukraine or somewhere, anyhow, traditional design.
They would ask if anybody had any catalogues, like ration catalogues.
Yes.
Not that they could order anything, but they wanted to take them home to their wives, in fact, so they could see what the fashions were. And people would hand them into somewhere, and then they would be taken onto the ships.
And I remember that the Edinburgh Quartet were here at the time, and there was people up from the Observer doing an article on these communists in the country. So the quartet went out in a boat, got filmed playing underneath one of these boats.
It was the same time as the Icelandics closed off the fishing for the English trawlers and all the freezer trawlers, so they came in with the mackerel as well. So there was a lot of boats working here then. Yeah, I was fishing for mackerel on the Persneters. and the pair trawlers as well. I used to just, what they call chance shot, was if anybody needed a crew for a week or a couple of weeks, they would just phone up the office and I would go out and crew for them if anyone was off sick, which suited me fine, because if you didn't like a boat you didn't have to stay on it for too long. I was on the Sarepta, which was a pair trawler from Fraserburgh, Flowing Tide from Gardenston. Pathfinder was the most I was on. I was on that for 2 years. That was from down near Girvan in the Ayrshire coast. I think altogether there was 5 boats from the west coast fishing mackerel. All the rest were east coast boats and Shetland. Well, there was one Bulgarian that my father had an old lawnmower and he was determined to have it before he left, so my father used to tease him and put the price up all the time. But a couple of days before he left, my father just gave it to him and he was delighted. And about 2 days later we heard the ship had sunk off the north end of Skye. Presumably the lawnmower went with it, but all the crew were saved. So there was a lot of pollution. I think people weren't so worried about it then. There was a lot of oil spills out there when they were refuelling the Klondykers from small tankers that used to come in, and there didn't seem to be much panic or anything about it. The beaches used to be just, you couldn't walk on them. It was between fish oil and diesel oil. I mean, it was, you couldn't stand on the beaches, they were that oily. But they seem to have rejuvenated the number of winkles that's been taken off them now, so it doesn't seem to have had a detrimental effect. The seabed used to be covered in mackerel bellies, the discarded bits of the fish they didn't use. But I'm sure the prawns and all the crabs and everything soon cleaned them up. So
at Hogmanay, a crowd of us were up at Ken McNaughton's, a pile of musician friends of his, and we decided to go down and visit the Bulgarian boat that was tied up. So on we went, and they had a Christmas tree in one corner, I remember, and they were sitting having a meal, and they cleared all the tables and proceeded to give us a 3-course meal, which was just fantastic. There was a fiddler, Ian Sinclair from Thurso. They just loved his playing, and we were doing Strip the Willows. It was just a great night. We just got to know these blokes over the time. Ullapool's bicentenary, 1988. At the end of the season, we invited those who were left to come ashore to a big party in the village hall, just to thank them for all taking part in the whole thing. A lot of the Klondykers had left by this time and headed down south, but there was 2 or 3 Bulgarian ones left, and a few of the crew and the officers came ashore, and they said they would bring some food, some drink, and they brought these 2 massive cardboard boxes full of sandwiches with sort of salami type of meats and very strange cheese and very rough brown East European bread, and they brought wine and we had whiskey, and we just had a fantastic time. It was just a great night. It was a great social time. There was no edge, oh they're Russian, you mustn't speak to them.
My first time in Ullapool was in 1982 as young sailor. I've been here with a East German fishing trawler Skagerrak, and after then with different ships. His name was Barents Sea, Atlantic. It was a small freezer trawler, and we have taken over the fish from the Scottish fishermen and produce it, this mackerel, this process, and freeze the mackerels. We want to go for shops and pubs and so. It was not a problem for East German sailors. I have enough money in East German currency, but in English pounds I've got only £10 per month. £10. I've bought different things, cassette recorders and glassings. And my first pint I've drank in the Seaforth in 1982. I remember on this very popular paper shop. It was our favorite shop. On the corner. Pallets, yeah. I remember Loch Broom was full of ships. Was of different ships. I remember of Dutch ships, East German ships and Russian ships. I remember we are in contact with Dutch ships. Anytime we drive water ski with Loch Broom inside. Yes, water ski with Dutch sailors, yeah, together with Dutch sailors, yeah. From 1982 and my last visit in East German time was 1989. That was the last time. And the next visit was with my wife in 1999.
I remember it must have been at the early start of the mackerel Klondike. I was working in the frigate. One of the boats, I think it was a Korean boat, they had Korean crew. One day the crew were allowed ashore for the afternoon. They did the shops, I suppose, and then they went for a drink. And they ended up in the Royal Hotel. They would have only had a couple of half pints, but the Koreans, not used to alcohol like that, they ended up to be quite drunk. And we could hear this whistle blowing. And here was Mr. Poe, the bosun, coming down from the Royal along the Shore Street, trying to round up maybe a dozen or so Koreans. They were very drunk. Well, he was herding them along and got them down past the frigate, round onto the pier, and we saw them going down onto the steps, and their lifeboat was in there waiting for them. Next minute, one of them jumped over the side and started swimming ashore, and then another one, and then another one, and they all jumped off the boat and swam ashore. I can't remember exactly how they got them back on the boat, but I think by that time they were all soaking wet and they'd probably sobered up quite a bit, so he didn't have too much trouble getting them back on the boat again.
I took a job as a casual with the Fishery office. Basically my duties were to assist a full-time fishery officer in monitoring the catches that the domestic fleet came in with and transported to the Klondike vessels. The Fishery office had the power to make the domestic boats and come to the pier to have their tanks tested as to how much fish they had on board, because this was all to do with quotas. But more often than not, they said, well, we'll meet you at a particular Klondiking vessel and we'll dip your tanks at the vessel. Nabby would take us out in the bittern to the vessel, and then we would board the fishing boat and dip his tanks. And as we dipped them, depending on the measurements we got, we could then estimate how much fish he had on board, and that had to agree with his logbook, and those figures then went to tally off his quotas. On certain occasions we had to monitor the boats that came in, and which would mean a full-time member of staff would be put on board the fishing boat, and he would have to monitor that fishing boat while he discharged all his fish. Going out in all weathers in the bittern with a big swell on, you had to jump onto the fishing boat and you had to catch it just right as the bittern went up. You had to grab the rail before it disappeared below you. And you were out there in all weathers. Some fishing boats would let you sit in the wheelhouse in the skipper's seat and you would just watch and count. Others weren't happy to have you in the wheelhouse at all and you would have to stand outside. Some would bring you tea and biscuits and even a meal, and others wouldn't because they didn't want you on board. Yeah, it was a very interesting period in my life. After my period with the Fishery office, I was working down at Corrie, and you would quite often see the little orange tender boats that the Klondykers had on. They would come chugging up and they'd moor up, come ashore, quite a few women as well, and they would pick the blackberries and just take them back on board.
I worked for a local marine electronics, Watt Marine. It was very, very busy. There was 4 marine electricians. They had to work at the Scottish boats that came into the pier, getting calls morning and night, and they also had to go out to the big Eastern Bloc factory ships as well. When I went to the job first, it was fairly quiet, but as the fishing took off, it got much, much busier, from Watt Marine having 2 marine electricians to having 5 at the height of the fishing. The phone was constantly ringing. This would be agents ringing to let us know that the boats were coming in and requirements that they might have for a radio or a sonar being broken down. And then the VHF radio would be going in the workshop. So there was always a constant chatter of East Coast accents and voices, and then you would get the Bulgarians or the Romanians radio coming in over the top, and just trying to, it was just busy. They used to come into the office and they always gave you foreign coins of their countries just as a souvenir. When I think back to the Klondykers, the village changed completely at the height of the fishing, particularly the very busy periods. There would be boats queued up at the pier, 5 or 6 deep, actually waiting so they could go out and land their fish. So there was hundreds of factory ships. The shops, the pubs, everywhere was really, really busy. And I suppose it gave the fishermen a break that they had to wait, and they would be filling the pubs waiting for it's their time to go and land the fish. When it was so busy, they just had to wait sometimes a day, sometimes 2 days to get their fish landed.
I was the manager of Lipton's on Shore Street when the Klondykers were coming in every winter. The staff room was in a flat above the shop, and I remember going up there one day and 2 or 3 of the men had followed the staff into the staff room, and the place was littered with clothes. They were trying to sell all things to them, and this happened quite a lot. The men used to come ashore. They looked like Michelin men, and they'd been back as slim as anything.
I worked in my uncle's grocer shop, VG Stores, in West Argyle Street, and we supplied Klondykers and the fishing boats. A typical Klondyker order would consist of potatoes, nets of cabbages, boxes of carrots, apples, bananas, oranges, Nescafe coffee, which they loved, fruit nut, chocolate, whole nut, every single kind of chewing gum and Habba Bubba. There was one day that when I went to deliver a fishing boat order, there was about 150 lorries between Calmac car park and on the harbour, and you just could not get down to the boat that you were looking for, so you had to carry everything. And I was on my last box, and the box fell apart and the melons were running down the pier. And the way that we used to get our orders, the captains maybe come in, or they would call up on a VHF, and same with the fishing boats if they wanted to put an order in, and then when they came alongside, their order would be ready for us to go down and deliver it to them. The pubs were very, very busy, especially if the weather was poor. The Scottish boats, they could go home to Peterhead, Fraserburgh, but not the Irish boats or the Shetland boats, so they would just tie up, and sometimes they were in the village for maybe about a week until the weather died down.
The connection with the local community and the Klondyking boats was pretty strong, and obviously football was a fairly universal sport that everybody was interested in. We only played the actual one match, but it was an enormous amount of interest in it. The Daily Record, the national newspaper, ran a cartoon strip with Angus Ogg. It was all revolving around this football match between the Klondykers and a local Highland community. The thing that I remember most was the number of people who attended. The standing joke was, of course, that for every football player from the Eastern European side that was on the pitch, there was 10 people watching what they were doing from the sidelines, obviously before the communist split. I got the honour of swapping pennants with the captain of the opposing team. I can't honestly remember the score. I think the local team won, but it was a great occasion. They seemed to be Russian and East German, and there was Bulgarian and Polish people. As far as I can remember, there was only the one match, Robbie. I do remember what a successful time it was for businesses in the winter. Ullapool suddenly moved from being a seasonal business to being an all-year-round destination. The thing that was always quite funny was at the crossover point between the tourist season and the Klondyking season coming on, because you could have a situation where you would have American tourists and you were pointing out to them that the boat across the water was actually a Russian factory ship, and it just about blew their mind, the fact that this was actually happening. Well, by this point, the Bulgarians seemed to be a sort of mainstay, and they liked to have a drink. And if you had a licence, then you did very well. The measure that they drank was so much bigger than the standard measure in this country. They would always ask for a double-double. When the Klondyking first started, I was working in the Royal Hotel, and the main things that we noticed was just the explosion of money that was available in the village. People on all sorts of company expenses, and it was totally not unheard of for 30, 40, 50 people to come in for breakfast and just to charge the breakfast to one of the main fish buyers in the area. There were great times, and there was so many characters that came out from that time, and the Royal Hotel was very much a sort of central place for these people, because they all stayed in the accommodation there. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
You forget how busy Ullapool was at that time. It was just mega. But obviously there was a buzz about the place, and it just brought so much money to Ullapool. It was unbelievable, the amount of money. After I left Templeton's, I went to work for VG. They would radio in their order as they were coming in, and we would have to get it all together and leave it in the van. John or Pat would have it down there for 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning, whatever. So it just went continuous. It went through the night. It was just amazing, the amount of stuff that went out. You just could not believe the amount of food that went out. It was just lorry loads coming into Ullapool. And everybody worked like 24 hours a day. And the other thing was the lorries. There was hundreds of lorries that went out that road every day, and the brie and the fish and everything just all along Shore Street. The smell and blood and it was horrific some days, you know.
The Klondykers started when I was harbour master at this port in the year 1976. The first ones to arrive were Bulgarian, and the names of the two that came first were the Melanita and Sagita. From then on, other ones arrived from various countries within the communistic regime. We carried out a pattern. This is to make sure that those that were filleting and processing the ship were kept on the outer reaches of our jurisdiction, so that there was no offal put over the side and landed on the beaches of Ullapool. Outside where they were anchored in what we called Annet Bay, the offal was okay because fish from the demersal side, like small whitefish, came and they took the offal away.
I found all the foreign seamen very, very generous and kind. They left their families for months and months on end, and they were very often young with families. And I at that time had a young son and daughter, and they were very, very generous to both. They go out, and my husband's sea rider, and we would go on board. They made a fine spread of the food they had, fish, caviar, or very often well-cooked baking good, great bakers on board, and we were entertained because there was a lot of singing at the time. They loved their music and they'd burst into song at the drop of a hat.
My uncle was Roddy McLean. He was thoroughly drowned at sea, and my father and myself took over and took the East Coast cruise in and out. And we took their stores and whatever they needed back and forth, early hours in the morning and a Monday morning, and then again if they're going home on a Thursday or a Friday. They landed the herring and the mackerel. Previous to that, they landed the herring to small ditch Klondykers when Sandy Duthie was the buyer in Ullapool. Everything's just basketed aboard the boats then, and it was the old stick fishing boats. Then it was just baskets of herring and then a shovel of ice, basket of herring, shovel of ice, into a refrigerated hold, and off they went to Norway and Denmark because they didn't have any fishing then themselves. Well, every hour of the day that we possibly could to make as much money obviously as we could. There was no luxuries. We'd fall asleep in between boats coming to land at the old Klondykers. We would sleep on the aluminium decks with our oilskins up to our necks, just to turn on your side if there was a shower of rain, and then the next herring boat would come in and you would just start landing again. These Soviet block vessels came in. They were freezer factories that were used to fishing deep sea themselves. We were first in line for the first customs officers to go out, myself and my father. I suppose it was in the late 70s too. And it was a very interesting time. There was people from all parts of the globe. Became very friendly, myself and my Paul Duncan, with one chef aboard one of the Bulgarian Klondykers. And he would have these big watermelons, and he would spread the table and everything for us, and we'd have a beer with him.
The Merman Reba was tied at the pier. There was no work for it, so Russia was broken up and they needed to change the flag. They had plenty hammer and thistles on board, but they didn't have the new flag, which was the tricolour. The only flag material we had was the original flag, so I've cut some of the piece of the original flag, and I got sheets, and I dyed one notch blue and the other was white. So I thought it would just be a metre. It was sort of colossal. There was a proper ceremony at the pier and raising the new flag. So the harbour master took some children with a hearing problem from a school in Dingwall, witnessed the handing and the changing of the flag at the pier.
Before the Klondykers, we had about 4 of a staff. At the height of the Klondyking, we had 16 of a staff. 1978, 3 Bulgarian Klondyker ships came to Ullapool. At that time, there was a gentleman, Sandy Duthie, in the village who was the first salesman, and he had taken those ships to Ullapool to get herring and mackerel, and he asked me would I supply those ships with vegetables and any other requirements. Ullapool was very, very busy with all those foreign factory ships. By that time we had 2 grocery stores in Ullapool supplying the ships. Russian transport ships were calling in on their way from Murmansk down to either Morocco, Namibia or the Falkland Isles. And they would call in at Ullapool and we would fill up those ships with provisions. On the 12th of November, there was a Russian celebration day and we had 5 motherships. One captain asked me, could he have 200 kilo of grapes with his order, but could I put them in kilo bags? So I reluctantly agreed to do this. After I left the ship heading back for the shore, he radioed the other ships and said, oh John, let's put my grapes in kilo bags. And immediately the other ships radioed into our office and said, oh, could we have our grapes in kilo bags? So that night we had to put a ton of grapes into kilo bags.
I got married to a man that came in on a Klondyker. He came into Ullapool in September 1990 and I met him within days of him arriving. We went out together and we got married in June of 1991. My job that I was involved in with the Klondykers was I would go out and get orders from them for stores. Some of the Russian ships that we worked on, we would set up a shop inside the ship and we would sell the items, coffee, soap, all the things that they needed to bring home for their families, loads of chocolate.
In about 10. The place always smelt of fish. There was quite a lot of noise even at night when the boats were tied up inside the harbour. They bought a lot of TVs, microwaves, electrical goods. My dad did the Argos catalogue for them. He used to fill a transit van 2 or 3 times a week. Until the Berlin Wall came down, they couldn't get a lot of the luxury items that we were used to having. We used to pay in dollars mostly, because they didn't get paid in sterling. There was Russians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Germans. At that point, you didn't really know one from the other. You called them all Bulgarians. They were always very friendly and they would always give you things, give you a bar of chocolate, and they were always trying to sell boats that they'd made out of bits of wood and scrap that they'd found lying about on the ships. And we used to go out to the ships on a regular basis to take orders, deliver orders, and they were rusting piles of junk from the outside, but quite well painted and maintained inside. I remember a man had a monkey in his cabin that he'd brought over from Africa.
My parents used to live in Moorfield Brae, and up the top of Moorfield Brae, around the back of the hill, was the local dump. And we would see them struggling up the hill and then a while later struggling back down, full of bags of things, old suitcases filled with I don't know what. One time we looked out and there was a few of them and they were carrying an old door, and on top of the old door was a bit of a cooker or a fridge or some white goods. He was the ship's doctor, Nikolai Haltikov, on one of the boats, a Bulgarian boat. He loved coming to my house the times that he did. I still keep in touch with Nikolai, and this is February 2015. All these years we've kept in touch. He's written me.
We had one particular boat that was used on contract to the Fishery office, who went out to check on all these ships, make sure their paperwork was right. And that led on to the transportation of their various officials from the land out to the ships. Stores for them in various vessels we had, and we carried heaps of money to pay them. We had various crews for the various boats, sometimes on part-time basis, others of more regular. But we had one interesting chap who was extremely interested in the Klondyking fleet. He made a personal interest of it, and that was Charlie Allen, and he took many good pictures of the ships. When they got paid, the ladies of the Russian ships wanted to go to Inverness. We carried them to the shore and off they went. And the most interesting part was getting them back aboard the ships again. The part that really was comical was the transporting of them from our vessel onto the ship. And they just used the crane. And they lowered a big tractor tyre down and all the ladies would crowd round the edge of the tractor tyre, hang on to the ropes and whoosh up onto the ship. The stores would be offloaded to the pier. We were quite well prepared for everything, and we went into a palletised system. So we loaded their stores onto our pallets, and we had a crane. We went out to the ship. They put their crane down, lifted the pallet up. The pier coped quite well. There was no problem at the pier either. The only problem sometimes was when they came ashore in their own lifeboats, they often tied up badly, and they would come back from their pub and the boat would be hanging high and dry. Living here by the seaside as we do, we were aware of all the frantic noise emanating from the pier. And one thing I remember with horror is the amount of pollution from the fish. The surface of the sea sometimes was just awash with mackerel oil, and after stormy weather it would congeal into grease, and every time you pick up anything off the shore your hands would be clotted with this grease. Now that was a bad thing, but it was inevitable really, because it was industry on a huge scale and the place was not fit for it.